In the mountains of Eastern Europe, where morning mist clings to ancient pines and silence can mean the difference between life and death, one woman's war was about to reach its final hour. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her faith in humanity. But as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the smoke rising from her burned supply shack, Elena Kozlov chambered her last bullet and prepared to write the final chapter of a conflict that had consumed 3 years of her life. What happened next would echo through military history books for decades to come. But the real story, the one about a mathematics teacher who became the most feared sniper in the resistance, begins much earlier, in a small village that no longer exists on any map. Plus, Elena Kozlov had always been good with numbers. As a mathematics teacher in the mountain village of Shrebrin, she could calculate trajectory angles in her head and solve complex equations while her students struggled with basic algebra. Her colleagues often joked that she saw the world in precise measurements and perfect calculations. They had no idea how prophetic those words would become. The war came to Shrebrin on a Tuesday morning in October. Elena was preparing her lesson on geometric progressions when the first shells hit the school's east wing. The explosion threw her across the classroom, and when she regained consciousness, half her students were dead. The other half were screaming. Outside, enemy forces were systematically destroying everything that made Shrebrin a home to 800 souls. Elena's husband, Dmitry, was a local police officer who had served the community for 15 years. When the invasion began, he organized the village's defense with a few hunting rifles and shotguns the residents owned. Elena watched from their kitchen window as he positioned men behind makeshift barricades, his calm voice carrying across the morning air as he directed their desperate resistance. She had seen him handle town drunks and settle neighbor disputes, but never this, never war. The battle for Shrebrin lasted 6 hours. Elena spent those hours in their basement, clutching their 8-year-old daughter Anna, listening to gunfire and explosions that grew closer with each passing minute. Anna kept asking when Daddy would come home, and Elena kept lying, saying soon, very soon, even as the sounds outside told a different story. Dmitry came home in pieces. The enemy soldiers brought his body to the town square along with 23 other defenders, arranging them in a neat row as a message to anyone thinking about resistance. Elena forced herself to look, to remember every detail of what they had done to the man who had taught her to fish and helped her grade papers late into the night. The occupying forces established their headquarters in the town hall and began what they called pacification procedures. Families were separated. Men between 16 and 60 were loaded into trucks and driven away. Women and children were herded into the school gymnasium, the same building where Elena had taught the quadratic formula to children who would never grow up to use it. Elena managed to escape during the second night by climbing through a damaged window in the gymnasium storage room. Anna was sick with fever, and Elena knew the cramped, unsanitary conditions would kill her daughter before any execution squad got the chance. She carried Anna through the forest for 3 days, surviving on stream water and wild berries, until they reached the resistance camp hidden in the mountain caves. The camp was a collection of desperate people living on borrowed time. There were former soldiers, teachers, farmers, shop owners, ordinary people who had lost everything and now existed in a world where survival depended on violence. The camp leader was Major Petrov, a career military officer whose entire battalion had been wiped out in the initial invasion. He looked at Elena and Anna with the weary expression of a man who had seen too many refugees arrive with nothing but trauma and empty stomachs. Elena proved useful almost immediately. Her mathematical mind made her excellent at calculating supply ratios and organizing the camp's meager resources. She could determine how to stretch their food supplies, where to position guards for maximum coverage, and how to plan raids that minimized risk while maximizing impact. Major Petrov began relying on her strategic input, especially for operations requiring precise timing and coordination. Anna recovered from her fever, but she had changed. The cheerful 8-year-old who used to sing while helping Elena grade papers had become silent and watchful. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was usually to ask about her father. Elena told her he was fighting in another place, that they would see him again when the war ended. Anna was too smart to believe this, but she pretended to accept the lie because she understood her mother needed to tell it. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that made supply runs nearly impossible and turned the mountain caves into ice boxes that claimed lives through cold as effectively as any bullet. Elena learned to handle weapons during this time, initially for camp defense, but gradually taking on more active roles in resistance operations. Her steady hands and analytical mind made her a natural with firearms, though she preferred to remain in supporting roles. The resistance conducted small raids throughout the winter, sabotaging supply convoys, gathering intelligence, and occasionally rescuing prisoners from detention facilities. Elena participated in planning sessions, using her knowledge of the local area to identify vulnerable targets and safe routes. She drew detailed maps, calculated optimal timing for attacks, and helped devise communication codes that kept their operations secret. The enemy response to resistance activities was swift and brutal. For every supply truck destroyed, they executed 10 civilians. For every communication line cut, they burned a farmhouse with the family still inside. The mathematical precision Elena brought to resistance planning was matched by the enemy's systematic approach to terror. Both sides were calculating acceptable losses, though only one side had any choice in the matter. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. The melting snow revealed mass graves around Schrebrand and other occupied villages, confirming what everyone feared about the fate of the missing men. It also opened mountain passes that allowed for more ambitious operations. Major Petrov began planning larger attacks, hoping to disrupt enemy operations enough to attract attention from Allied forces fighting in other regions. Elena's role evolved during these spring operations. Her talent for precise calculations caught the attention of Sergeant Victor Malik, a former Army sniper who had joined the resistance after his unit was disbanded. Victor noticed how Elena could estimate distances and angles almost instinctively, skills that typically took snipers months to develop. He began teaching her advanced marksmanship, initially as a way to improve camp security, but soon recognizing her exceptional natural ability. The first time Elena killed someone, it was during a raid on an enemy checkpoint. She had positioned herself on a hillside overlooking the road, tasked with providing cover for the main assault team. When an enemy soldier moved to flank Victor's position, Elena made a split-second calculation, wind speed, distance, target movement, and pulled the trigger. The soldier dropped instantly, and the raid continued without the resistance fighters even realizing how close they had come to disaster. Elena felt nothing at first. Later, in her cave shelter with Anna sleeping beside her, she tried to process what she had done. She thought about her mathematics students, about the peaceful life she had built with Dmitri, about the person she used to be. That person seemed like someone she had read about in a book, real but impossibly distant. The woman who had made a perfect shot at 300 meters to save her friends was someone else entirely. Victor continued her training throughout the spring and into summer. Elena proved to have an almost supernatural ability to read environmental conditions and adjust for variables that affected bullet trajectory. She could account for wind, temperature, humidity, and target movement in ways that impressed even experienced military snipers. Her background in mathematics gave her an understanding of ballistics that typically took years of practical experience to develop. The resistance began using Elena for increasingly important operations. Her ability to eliminate specific targets from extreme distances made her invaluable for missions requiring surgical precision. She could neutralize sentries, eliminate officers, and create diversions without exposing the main assault teams to unnecessary risk. Major Petrov started planning operations specifically around Elena's capabilities, using her skills as a force multiplier for the entire resistance effort. Enemy forces began to notice the pattern of precise, long-range eliminations. Their patrols became more cautious, their officers stayed further from front lines, and their communications mentioned a ghost sniper who seemed to strike from impossible distances. Elena took pride in this psychological impact, understanding that fear was often more effective than firepower in guerrilla warfare. Anna watched her mother's transformation with a silent understanding that children develop in wartime. She helped maintain Elena's equipment, cleaned her rifle, and organized ammunition with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on attention to detail. She never asked what her mother was doing when she left camp for days at a time, just as Elena never explained the mathematical calculations that determined which targets would have the greatest strategic impact. The summer brought news that Allied forces were advancing in other regions, but also intelligence that enemy reinforcements were being deployed to eliminate resistance operations. The war was entering a new phase, and the mountain resistance would either prove its worth or be destroyed in the escalating violence. Elena had evolved from a refugee seeking safety into a weapon that could shape the outcome of battles, but she was about to face challenges that would test every skill Victor had taught her and every tactical lesson Major Petrov had shared. The comfortable rhythm of calculated raids and precise eliminations was about to be shattered by events that would push Elena beyond anything she had experienced. The enemy was adapting to the resistance tactics, and they had identified the mountain caves as a primary threat to their occupation. A major operation was being planned that would either destroy the resistance entirely or force Elena to become something even more dangerous than a ghost sniper. As summer ended and autumn began its return to the mountains, Elena cleaned her rifle and counted her remaining ammunition. She had become someone she never intended to be, but the war was far from over. The woman who had once taught geometry to village children was now calculating angles of death with the same precision she had once used to explain mathematical theorems. The transformation was complete, but the final test was approaching with the certainty of winter's return to the high country. The enemy's new strategy became clear on a crisp October morning when Elena returned from a reconnaissance mission to find smoke rising from 3 separate locations in the valley below. They were no longer content to hold territory and wait for the resistance to exhaust itself. They had begun systematically destroying every structure that could provide shelter or supplies to guerrilla fighters, turning the entire mountain region into a wasteland where survival itself became a form of resistance. Elena positioned herself on an outcrop overlooking the burned farmhouse where the Petkovic family had lived for 4 generations. Through her scope, she watched enemy soldiers methodically destroying everything of value. Livestock shot and left to rot, grain stores set ablaze, even the well contaminated with diesel fuel. This wasn't military strategy. It was deliberate cruelty designed to make the mountains uninhabitable for anyone supporting the resistance. Major Petrov called an emergency meeting that evening in the main cave chamber. The resistance leadership had intercepted communications indicating that the enemy had identified their general location and was planning a massive sweep operation. Intelligence suggested they had deployed specialized mountain warfare units equipped for extended operations in harsh terrain. These weren't the conscripted soldiers and local militia the resistance had been fighting. These were professionals trained specifically to eliminate guerrilla operations. Elena studied the tactical maps spread across the cave floor, while Anna sat quietly in the corner, mending clothes with the focused concentration of someone who understood that every task, no matter how small, contributed to survival. The enemy's approach was methodical and patient, designed to systematically eliminate hiding places and supply sources until the resistance had no choice but to surrender or die from exposure and starvation. Victor had been monitoring enemy communications through their captured radio equipment, and the intelligence he gathered painted a troubling picture. The enemy had identified Elena specifically as a high-value target. They called her the Mountain Ghost and had assigned a specialist hunter-killer team to track her down. The team was led by Captain Marcus Weber, a former police sniper with an impressive record of eliminating insurgent leaders in occupied territories. The psychological warfare intensified as autumn progressed. Enemy forces began broadcasting messages over captured civilian radio frequencies, offering substantial rewards for information leading to Elena's capture. They described her family background, mentioned Anna by name, and promised safe passage to neutral territory for anyone willing to betray the resistance. Elena listened to these broadcasts in silence, understanding that they represented more than propaganda. They were proof that the enemy considered her elimination essential to their success. Elena's response was characteristically calculated. She began planning operations designed not just to inflict casualties, but to send clear messages about the futility of hunting her. When Weber's team established an observation post on Hill 247, Elena spent 3 days studying their routines before eliminating their communications specialist with a shot fired from over 600 meters away. She left the body in a position where the remaining team members would find it with a note written in precise mathematical notation, coordinates that spelled out "try harder" when plotted on a map. The cat-and-mouse game escalated through November as both sides adapted their tactics. Weber proved to be an intelligent adversary who understood Elena's psychological profile better than previous enemy commanders. Instead of trying to track her directly, he began targeting the infrastructure that supported her operations, destroying supply caches, eliminating resistance sympathizers in nearby villages, and setting elaborate traps designed to force Elena into predetermined killing zones. Elena's most dangerous mission came when Weber's forces captured a resistance courier carrying detailed intelligence about upcoming operations. The courier, a teenage boy named Stefan, was being held at a fortified position while specialists attempted to extract information that could compromise the entire network. Major Petrov considered the intelligence too valuable to lose and the boy too young to abandon. But a rescue operation would require Elena to penetrate defenses specifically designed to counter her tactics. Elena spent 2 days reconnoitering the enemy position, a converted monastery perched on a rocky outcrop with excellent fields of fire in all directions. Weber had positioned his men to cover every possible approach route, and the building itself had been reinforced to provide protection against long-range fire. Traditional sniper tactics would be useless against such a prepared position, requiring Elena to develop entirely new approaches to achieve her objectives. The rescue operation began at midnight during a snowstorm that provided visual cover, but made precision shooting extremely challenging. Elena approached the monastery through a network of drainage ditches and stone walls that offered concealment, but required her to crawl through freezing mud for over 2 hours. Anna had insisted on helping prepare Elena's equipment, checking every piece of gear with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that her mother's survival depended on absolute attention to detail. Elena's breakthrough came when she realized that Weber's defensive preparations, while militarily sound, contained a mathematical flaw. The angles of his overlapping fields of fire created a small gap, no more than 3 meters wide, where an attacker could approach the building's foundation without being detected. Reaching that gap required Elena to make a series of precisely timed movements coordinated with the storm's wind patterns, using the sound of driving snow to mask any noise from her approach. The infiltration took 4 hours of patient movement, with Elena advancing only when wind gusts provided auditory cover and freezing in place whenever the storm briefly subsided. She reached the monastery's foundation as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, positioning herself beneath a window where captured intelligence suggested Stefan was being held. The rescue would require split-second timing and absolute precision. One mistake would trigger alarms that would bring the entire garrison down on her position. Elena's solution was elegant in its mathematical simplicity. She had observed that the guards changed positions every 30 minutes according to a rigid schedule that prioritized covering external approaches over internal security. During the changeover, there was a 40-second window when the corridor outside Stefan's room was unmonitored. Elena used shaped charges made from captured enemy explosive devices to blow a hole through the monastery's ancient stone wall, extract Stefan, and escape before the guards could respond to the explosion. The rescue succeeded, but Weber's reaction demonstrated his growing understanding of Elena's capabilities. Instead of pursuing her directly, he began a campaign of systematic destruction designed to force her into increasingly desperate situations. His forces targeted every known resistance sympathizer in the region, executed suspected collaborators in public displays designed to terrorize local populations, and destroyed food supplies that resistance fighters depended on for winter survival. Elena realized that Weber was trying to force her into a decisive confrontation by making guerrilla warfare unsustainable. He understood that her precision and patience were her greatest advantages, so he was creating circumstances where she would have no choice but to act quickly and take greater risks. The strategy was psychologically sophisticated, designed to exploit Elena's protective instincts towards civilian populations and her tactical preference for calculated, long-term approaches. The breaking point came in December when Weber's forces surrounded the village of Novak Selo, where several resistance families were hiding among the civilian population. Weber announced that the village would be destroyed unless Elena surrendered within 48 hours, and began executing one villager every 6 hours to demonstrate his seriousness. Elena understood that this was the trap Weber had been building toward, a situation where her military value to the resistance would be weighed against innocent lives. Major Petrov forbade Elena from attempting a rescue, arguing that preserving her capabilities was more important than saving individual civilians. Elena listened to his reasoning, understood the military logic, and ignored the order completely. She began planning an operation that would either eliminate Weber's entire command structure or result in her own death. There would be no middle ground and no tactical retreat if the mission failed. Elena spent her last night in the caves with Anna, teaching her daughter advanced mathematics problems that would help pass time during the long winter months ahead. Anna understood without being told that this might be their final conversation, but she focused on the equations with the same quiet intensity she brought to all tasks. Elena explained how mathematical principles could help solve practical problems, calculating food distributions, determining optimal guard schedules, predicting weather patterns that affected supply operations. Victor provided Elena with her finest rifle and the last of their match-grade ammunition, understanding that this operation would determine the resistance's future effectiveness. He had taught her everything about advanced marksmanship, but the tactical challenges she was about to face would require innovations that no training manual covered. Elena was planning to assault a fortified position defended by professional soldiers using nothing but mathematical precision and strategic patience. The morning Elena left for Novak Selo, she carried enough supplies for 3 days, but planned for an operation that would end within hours of its beginning. She had calculated every variable she could control and accepted that success would depend on factors beyond mathematical analysis. Luck, enemy mistakes, and the psychological pressure that came from knowing that failure meant death for everyone she was trying to protect. Weber was waiting for her with the confidence of someone who believed he understood his opponent's capabilities and limitations. He had prepared defenses designed specifically to counter Elena's known tactics and positioned his forces to channel her into predetermined kill zones. What he couldn't account for was Elena's willingness to abandon everything that had kept her alive for the past 2 years: patience, calculation, and tactical restraint. The final confrontation would require her to become something even more dangerous than the mountain ghost that enemy forces feared. It would require her to become desperate. Elena reached the ridge overlooking Novak Selo just as the 6th villager was being led to the execution post in the town square. Through her scope, she could see Weber directing the proceedings with the calm professionalism of someone who viewed terror as simply another military tool. The villager was an elderly man she recognized, Milos Yovanovitch, who had taught her daughter to whittle wooden toys during the early days in the resistance caves. Weber shot him personally, then checked his watch and announced that the next execution would occur in precisely 6 hours. The village layout presented Elena with an impossible tactical problem. Weber had positioned his forces to cover every possible sniper position within effective range, using the buildings themselves as a defensive network that eliminated traditional approaches. Snipers were stationed on the church bell tower, the school roof, and 3 separate houses that provided overlapping fields of fire. Any attempt to engage from long range would immediately reveal Elena's position and trigger a coordinated response that would overwhelm her before she could eliminate enough targets to matter. Elena spent the first day studying the enemy positions through her scope, mapping their routines, and identifying potential weaknesses in their deployment. Weber had made only one apparent mistake. He had positioned his command post in the village school, the same building where Elena had once taught mathematics to children who were now either dead or scattered across refugee camps. The irony wasn't lost on her, but more importantly, she knew the building's layout better than any enemy soldier could learn from blueprints and reconnaissance. The school had been built in 1962 according to standard communist-era educational facility designs, with thick concrete walls and small windows positioned high on each classroom wall. Elena remembered complaining about the poor natural lighting, never imagining that those same design features would someday provide tactical advantages. The building's heating system used large ducts that ran beneath the floors, ducts that Elena had helped maintain during her teaching years when budget constraints required faculty to handle basic repairs. Weber's forces had established their communications center in Elena's former classroom, using the same space where she had taught trigonometry to transform their radio equipment into a coordination hub for the entire operation. Elena could see enemy personnel moving past the windows where she used to hang educational posters about geometric theorems and algebraic equations. The mathematics she had once used to educate children would now help her calculate the precise angles needed to eliminate their killers. Elena's plan required her to abandon every principle of sniper warfare that Victor had taught her. Instead of engaging from long range with carefully calculated shots, she would need to penetrate the enemy defensive perimeter and conduct close-quarters combat in an environment where her rifle would be more liability than asset. The mathematics of the operation were elegantly simple. She had to reach the school's heating system access point, navigate through underground ducts to reach the command post, and eliminate Weber before his forces could respond. The heating ducts presented their own challenges. Elena's reconnaissance revealed that the system had been partially damaged during the initial occupation, with several sections collapsed or blocked by debris. She would need to crawl through spaces designed for maintenance access, not human passage, while carrying enough ammunition to complete her mission. The route from the access point to the classroom would require her to navigate approximately 60 meters of confined space in complete darkness, using only her memory of the building's layout for guidance. Elena began her approach during the pre-dawn hours of the second day, using a route that took her through the village cemetery where headstones provided concealment from enemy observation posts. Weber had positioned sentries to cover the main approaches, but had underestimated the tactical value of terrain features that offered psychological as well as physical cover. Most soldiers avoided graveyards during night operations, viewing them as unlucky or unsettling, which created gaps in what should have been continuous surveillance. The heating system access point was located behind the school's maintenance shed, protected by a heavy steel grate that Elena had helped install years earlier when the school board decided to improve security after a series of vandalism incidents. Elena knew the grate's locking mechanism was designed to prevent children from accessing dangerous equipment, not to stop determined infiltration, but removing it would require tools that might create enough noise to alert nearby sentries. Elena's solution demonstrated the patient calculation that had made her such an effective sniper. She had brought a small container of acid stolen from the Resistance's improvised explosives laboratory, using it to quietly dissolve the grate's lock mechanism over the course of 30 minutes. The chemical process was virtually silent and left the grate's external appearance unchanged, allowing Elena to open it without creating any visual evidence of tamper-free that enemy patrols might notice. The journey through the heating ducts tested every aspect of Elena's physical and psychological endurance. The spaces were barely large enough for her body, forcing her to army crawl while dragging her rifle and ammunition through confined passages that seemed designed to trigger claustrophobia. Elena controlled her breathing using mathematical exercises, calculating prime number sequences, and solving complex equations in her head to maintain psychological discipline during the 40-minute underground journey. Elena reached the classroom heating vent as Weber was conducting a morning briefing with his subordinate officers. Through the metal grating, she could hear him discussing the day's planned executions and outlining search procedures designed to flush Elena from whatever hiding place she had chosen. Weber's voice carried the confident tone of someone who believed he had anticipated every possible enemy action and prepared appropriate countermeasures. Elena's first shot came through the heating vent, eliminating Weber's communications specialist before anyone in the room could identify the source of the gunfire. Her second shot dropped Weber's second-in-command, creating enough confusion to allow Elena to kick out the vent grating and roll into the classroom, where she had once taught the Pythagorean theorem to students who dreamed of becoming engineers and architects. The firefight that followed was brutal and intimate, conducted in a space Elena knew better than any enemy soldier could. She used her knowledge of the room's layout to anticipate enemy movements, positioning herself behind the heavy oak desk where she had once graded papers to gain cover from return fire. Weber proved to be a skilled combatant who quickly adapted to the unexpected tactical situation, but Elena's familiarity with the environment gave her advantages that military training couldn't overcome. Elena's decisive advantage came when Weber attempted to flank her position by moving through the classroom's supply closet. Elena knew that the closet's floor had a weak spot where water damage had compromised the concrete foundation, a problem she had reported repeatedly to school maintenance without ever receiving approval for expensive repairs. When Weber stepped on that section of floor, it collapsed under his weight, sending him tumbling into the basement and breaking his leg in the process. Elena found Weber in the basement where the school's old heating boiler had been located, pinned beneath debris from the collapsed floor and unable to reach his weapon. He looked up at her with the expression of a professional soldier who understood that his tactical miscalculation had cost him everything. Elena stood over him with her rifle pointed at his chest, remembering the children who had died in this building and the villagers who had been executed to draw her into this confrontation. Weber spoke first, offering intelligence about enemy troop dispositions in exchange for medical treatment and prisoner status according to international conventions. Elena listened to his proposal while calculating wind patterns through the broken basement windows and estimating the time required for enemy reinforcements to reach the school. Her mathematical analysis indicated that Weber's information might indeed be valuable to the Resistance's future operations. Elena's response was a single shot fired with the same precision she had used to eliminate targets at 600 meters. Weber died instantly, his body falling beside the old boiler where Elena had once taken shelter during air raid drills when the school practiced civil defense procedures. Elena felt the same emotional emptiness that had followed her first kill, but amplified by the intimate nature of close-quarters combat and the familiar surroundings where the confrontation had taken place. Elena's escape from the school required her to fight through enemy forces that had surrounded the building in response to the gunfire from Weber's final briefing. She used her knowledge of the school's layout to reach the building's rear exit through a series of corridors and stairwells that enemy forces hadn't had time to secure. Her exit strategy took her through the school library, where she had often spent lunch breaks reading mathematics journals and preparing lesson plans for advanced students. The running battle through Novak Selo tested Elena's urban combat skills as enemy forces attempted to corner her using superior numbers and coordinated movement. Elena survived by applying the same mathematical principles she used for long-range shooting to close-quarters tactical problems, calculating angles of approach, predicting enemy movement patterns, and using environmental features to maximum advantage. She eliminated 7 enemy soldiers during her fighting withdrawal, each shot placed with the precision that had made her legendary among resistance fighters. Elena's final challenge came at the village outskirts, where enemy forces had established a roadblock designed to prevent her escape into the mountain forests. The position was well constructed and professionally manned, but Elena noticed that the soldiers had made a fundamental error in their positioning. They had oriented their defensive preparations toward the main road without adequately covering the small footpath that led through the village cemetery, the same route Elena had used to approach the village 2 days earlier. Elena's escape through the cemetery required her to move through fresh graves of villagers who had been executed during Weber's terror campaign. She recognized names on makeshift wooden crosses, remembering families she had known during her teaching years, and resistance fighters who had died protecting civilians from enemy operations. Elena understood that Weber's death wouldn't bring back any of these victims, but it would prevent future executions and demonstrate to enemy forces that their specialist hunters were not invincible. Elena reached the forestry line as enemy reinforcements arrived in the village, too late to prevent Weber's elimination, but in time to discover the extent of their tactical defeat. Intelligence reports later indicated that Weber's death had a significant psychological impact on enemy forces throughout the region, forcing them to adopt more defensive postures that reduced their effectiveness against resistance operations. Elena had achieved her strategic objective, but at a cost that went beyond simple casualty statistics. The journey back to the resistance caves took Elena 3 days of careful movement through terrain that enemy patrols were now searching with renewed intensity. Anna was waiting when Elena finally returned, and she could see in her daughter's eyes the understanding that something fundamental had changed. Elena had eliminated the immediate threat to resistance operations, but in the process had pushed herself beyond the psychological boundaries that separated calculated violence from something darker and more personal. Major Petrov debriefed Elena about the operation's tactical details, while Victor examined her rifle and noted that she had expended exactly 11 rounds during the entire mission, a remarkable economy of ammunition that demonstrated her continued precision even under extreme stress. Elena provided detailed intelligence about enemy defensive procedures and identified weaknesses that could be exploited in future operations, but her colleagues could see that the mission had extracted a price that couldn't be measured in military terms. Elena spent the following weeks training other resistance fighters in advanced marksmanship techniques, passing along the skills Victor had taught her and the tactical innovations she had developed during her confrontation with Weber's forces. Anna helped organize the training materials and maintain the equipment, continuing her quiet support role in resistance operations while Elena prepared other fighters to carry on the mission if she didn't survive future operations. The war continued through the winter and into spring, but Elena's role gradually shifted from active operations to strategic planning and training responsibilities. She had proven that enemy specialist forces could be defeated, but the psychological cost of intimate violence had changed her approach to combat. Elena remained an effective resistance leader, but the woman who had eliminated Weber in her former classroom was different from the mathematics teacher who had first picked up a rifle to defend her fellow refugees. Years later, when military historians studied the resistance's effectiveness during the Mountain Campaign, they would identify Elena's elimination of Weber as a turning point that demonstrated the vulnerability of professional forces to guerrilla tactics adapted by intelligent civilians. Elena herself never spoke publicly about the operation, preferring to focus on the mathematical principles she had used rather than the emotional reality of combat in a place where she had once taught children to solve problems using logic and systematic thinking. Elena survived the war and eventually returned to teaching, though never in the same village where the conflict had begun. Anna grew up to become an engineer, using the mathematical foundation her mother had provided to build bridges instead of calculating trajectories for eliminating enemy soldiers. Elena's rifle was displayed in a museum dedicated to resistance fighters, but the memories of dawnlight filtering through smoke from her burn supply shack and the single shot that ended her war remained private calculations that she never shared with anyone, even those who might have understood the precise mathematics of survival in impossible circumstances.